Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance, and in this video we will cover the effectiveness of compound versus isolation lifts on muscle hypertrophy and how this influences exercise selection in a training program. First and foremost, we need to define what exactly compound and isolation lifts are and how they are different. Let's now cover what both of these terms mean. Compound lifts refer to exercises that involve active movement of more than one joint. These exercises also generally involve more muscles working simultaneously to perform the movement. As a result, we can usually lift much heavier loads using compound lifts. Some examples of compound lifts include exercises like the classic squat, row, and pressing variations. Isolation lifts are exercises that involve active movement of only one joint. These exercises only target one key muscle group, although there are usually other accessory muscles still actively involved. As a result, the loads we use are generally much lighter for isolation lifts. Some examples of isolation lifts include calf raises, bicep curls, and tricep extension variations. So what type of exercise is better for hypertrophy, compound or isolation lifts? If we look at this from a direct comparison standpoint, there is no real difference in muscle growth. We can achieve equal hypertrophy outcomes using both compound and isolation lifts. This is because both forms of exercise will stress our muscles and provide a hypertrophic stimulus. However, when selecting exercises for a training program, there are other considerations that may influence our decision. We will now cover what factors may influence whether we choose a compound or isolation lift to train a particular muscle group. The first consideration is what will be the limiting factor during the exercise. The goal of hypertrophy training is to stress a specific muscle against resistance, and we want all this stress to be directed to that muscle, not to other muscles or tissues. So we want the target muscle of the exercise to be the limiting factor for each set. However, the limiting factor may differ when comparing compound and isolation lifts. For isolation lifts, the target muscle will almost always be the limiting factor, assuming technique is strict and effective. There is a very low chance that another muscle will limit performance before the target muscle unless the trainee is using very poor technique, which probably isn't providing a great hypertrophic stimulus in the first place. For example, during a bicep curl, assuming technique is strict, the biceps are the only real muscle that are going to fatigue and limit performance. The forearm flexors will also be trained, but they are not going to be taxed to the same extent as the biceps and are unlikely to limit performance. Therefore, we can be confident that during isolation lifts, the hypertrophic stimulus on the target muscle will be maximized with each set. For compound lifts, this is not always the case. Because multiple muscles and joints are involved in the exercise, it is possible for accessory muscles, stabilizer muscles, or even the cardiorespiratory system to limit performance before the target muscle. If we maintain a strict and effective technique, the target muscle should be the limiting factor to performance, but we can't be as confident as we can be with isolation lifts. Furthermore, even if the target muscle limits performance like we want it to, other muscle groups won't be the limiting factor. This means that we are only really maximizing the hypertrophic stimulus for a single muscle group, while the other muscle groups are receiving an inferior stimulus. For example, during a dumbbell bench press, if technique is on point, then the chest muscles should limit performance. This will provide a great stimulus for the chest, but it won't maximize the stimulus for accessory muscles like the triceps. So even though compound lifts train multiple muscle groups, the stimulus is not equal for all muscles involved. Another consideration when comparing compound and isolation lifts is loadability. This simply refers to how heavy the exercise can be loaded. There is probably some advantage to training a muscle group with different rep ranges in a training program, rather than just a single range. This means that it is probably a good idea to include some higher rep work with lighter loads and also some lower rep work with heavier loads. While isolation lifts are well suited to light load training, it is not really feasible to perform isolation lifts with heavier loads. This is because they place excessive stress on a single joint and are easy to deviate your technique. Furthermore, compound lifts are simply able to be loaded much heavier than isolation lifts anyway. So to provide a heavy load stimulus, compound lifts are going to be far superior. For example, it would be very difficult to train any of the back muscles with reasonably heavy loads using isolation lifts. Instead, compound lifts like vertical pulls and horizontal rows allow much more significant loads to be used. There are also theories that heavier loads may preferentially hypertrophy more fast twitch muscle fibers over slow twitch fibers. This means that compound lifts using heavier loads may result in greater growth of the fast twitch fibers, while lighter isolation lifts may preference slow twitch fibers. However, this is not a well-established concept, it is just a theory at best. Another consideration when selecting compound versus isolation lifts is the biarticular muscle theory. This theory suggests that biarticular muscles aren't maximally recruited when opposing actions occur at different joints. So to break this concept down, let's look at what a biarticular muscle is. A biarticular muscle is a muscle which acts on two or more joints. An example of this is the hamstrings muscles, excluding the short head of the biceps femoris, which only acts on the knee joint. However, if we look at the anatomy of the other three hamstrings muscles, they all originate on the pelvis and attach on either the tibia or fibula. This means that they cross both the hip and knee joints, contributing to both hip extension and knee flexion. In terms of the biarticular muscle theory, let's look at the hamstrings during a squat. During any squatting movement, we have hip extension and knee extension. So in this case, the hamstrings would be able to contribute to hip extension, however the knee joint extends, which means that the hamstrings are lengthening at this joint. Therefore, the hamstrings aren't maximally recruited during a squat because there are opposing muscle actions. This has relevance to selecting compound or isolation lifts. Although compound lifts involve more muscle groups than isolation lifts, they might not be maximally recruiting some accessory muscles. So we may not actually be getting as much of a hypertrophy stimulus as we may think. However, with isolation lifts, we are only moving one joint, which means that the muscle group involved must be maximally recruited. So if we look back at the hamstrings, an exercise like a back extension or hamstring curl will isolate hip extension and knee flexion respectively, which will ensure the movement trains the hamstrings. This same concept also occurs in muscles like the biceps during rows or the long head of the triceps during pressing exercises. And the last consideration when comparing compound and isolation lifts is time efficiency. Quite clearly, compound lifts are much more time efficient than isolation lifts. This is because compound lifts involve more muscles during each exercise, while isolation lifts only really train one muscle group primarily. This means that we accumulate more total volume for each muscle group in a shorter time frame by using compound lifts. This may be advantageous for those who have limited time to train and want to make their training sessions as efficient as possible. Furthermore, compound lifts may even provide enough stimulus for certain muscle groups that they don't even need to be directly trained at all. For example, it is common for trainees to adequately develop the front delts and abs over time simply by performing compound lifts in their training program and never directly training them. So what practical recommendations can we conclude from all this information? Firstly, neither compound or isolation lifts are inherently better than the other. Rather, exercise selection comes down to context and personal preference. There seems to be some unique benefits to both compound and isolation lifts that may make it more or less effective in certain situations. Therefore, it is probably best to include a combination of both forms of training in a well-rounded program. As a general guide, trainees may want to perform compound lifts for the major muscle groups. This includes exercises like pressing, pulling, squats, and hinge movements to hit basically all muscle groups in the body. Isolation lifts can then be used to additionally train the muscle groups that weren't maximally stressed in the compound lifts. Also, additional isolation lifts can also be used to accumulate more volume for muscle groups that the trainee wants to particularly emphasize. This is because compound lifts are generally more locally and systemically fatiguing than isolation lifts, so to increase the volume of compound lifts is not always feasible. For example, the trainee may perform leg extensions in addition to squats to accumulate more quad volume, since performing more sets of squats may be too fatiguing on the body. Furthermore, performing both compound and isolation lifts in a program will provide greater exercise variation. This will allow the same muscle groups to be targeted from different angles and with different rep ranges and loads. This variation in stress will probably be more effective than training with a monotonous stimulus. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already.